Good morning, boys and girls. Happy Friday. We're ready for Chapter 9. Pippi goes to a coffee party. Tommy and Annika's mother had invited a few ladies to a coffee party. And as she had done plenty of baking, she thought Tommy and Annika might invite Pippi over at the same time. The children could entertain each other and give no trouble to anyone. Has she met Pippi? Tommy and Annika were overjoyed when their mother told them and immediately dashed to Pippi's to invite her. Pippi was in the garden watering the few flowers still in bloom with an old rusty watering can. As it was raining cats and dogs the day that Tommy told Pippi, her watering hardly seemed necessary. "Well, that's what you say," said Pippi grudgingly. "But I've lain awake all night thinking what fun it was going to be to get up and water, and I'm not going to let a little rain stand in my way." Now Annika came forth with the delightful news about the party. "A coffee party? Me?" cried Pippi. And she was so excited that she began to water Tommy instead of the rose bush she intended to sprinkle. "Oh, what will happen? Oh, I'm so nervous. Oh, what if I can't behave myself?" "Of course you can," said Annika. "Don't be too certain about that," said Pippi. "You can be sure I'll try, but I've noticed several times that people don't think I know how to behave even when I'm trying as hard as I can." At sea, we were never so fussy about things like that. But I promise I'll take special pains today so that you won't be ashamed of me. "Good," said Tommy. And he and Annika hurried home again in the rain. "This afternoon at 3 o'clock, don't forget," said Annika, peeking out from under the umbrella. At 3 o'clock, a very stylish young lady walked up to the steps of the Settergrens' house. It was Pippi Longstocking. For this special occasion, she had unbraided her pigtails, and her red hair hung like a lion's mane around her. Oh, just wait. With a red crayon, she had painted her mouth fiery red, and she had blackened her eyebrows so that she looked almost dangerous. With the crayon, she had also painted her fingernails, and she had put big green rosettes on her shoes. Look at her.
Aww.
"I should imagine I'll be the most stylish person at all this party," she contentedly said to herself as she rang the doorbell. In the Settergrens' living room sat 3 fine ladies, and with them Tommy and Annika, and their mother. A wonderful coffee table had been spread, and in the fireplace a fire was burning brightly. The ladies were talking quietly with one another, and Tommy and Annika were sitting on the sofa looking at an album. Everything was so peaceful. Suddenly the peace was shattered. "Attention!" A piercing cry came from the hall, and the next minute Pippi Longstocking stood in the doorway. She had cried so loudly and so unexpectedly that the ladies had jumped in their seats. "Forward, march!" came the next command. And Pippi, with measured steps, walked up to Mrs. Settergren. "Halt!" she stopped. "Arms forward! 1, 2!" she cried. With both hands gripped one of Miss Settergren's and shook it heartily. "Knees bend!" she shrieked, and curtsied prettily. Then she smiled at Mrs. Settergren and said in her ordinary voice, "You see, I'm really very shy, so if I didn't give myself some commands, I'd just stand in the hall and not dare to come in." Then she rushed up to the other ladies and kissed them on the cheek. "Charming, charming, upon my honor," said she, for she had once heard a stylish gentleman say that to a lady. Then she sat down in the best chair she could find. Mrs. Settergren had intended for the children to have their party up in Tommy and Annika's room, but Pippi stayed calmly in her chair, slapped herself on the knee, and said, looking at the coffee table, "Whoo, that certainly looks good. When do we begin?" At that moment, Ella, the maid, came in with the coffee pot, and Miss Settergren said, "Please come and have some coffee." "First!" cried Pippi, and she was up at the table in 2 skips. She heaped as many cakes as she could onto a plate, threw 5 lumps of sugar into a coffee cup, emptied half the cream pitcher into her cup, and was back at her chair with the lute even before the ladies had reached the table. Pippi stretched her legs out in front of her and placed the plate of cakes between her toes. Then she merrily dunked cakes in her coffee cup and stuffed so many in her mouth at once that she couldn't have uttered a word no matter how hard she tried. In the twinkling of an eye, she had finished up all the cakes on the plate. She got up, struck the plate as if it were a tambourine, and went up to the table to see if there were any cakes left. The ladies looked disapprovingly at her, but that didn't bother her. Chatting gaily, she walked around the table, snatching a cake here and a cake there. "It certainly was nice of you to invite me," she said. "I've never ever been to a coffee party before." On the table, stood a large cream pie, decorated in the center with a piece of red candy. Pippi stood with her hands behind her back and looked at it. Suddenly, she bent down and snatched the candy with her teeth.
Oh.
But she dived a little too hastily, and when she came up again, her whole face was covered with whipping cream. "Goody!" laughed Pippi. "Now we can play blind man's bluff, for we've certainly got a blind man all made to order. I can't see a thing." She stuck her tongue out and licked away the cream. "This was indeed a dreadful accident," said she. "All the pie's ruined now anyway, so I might as well eat it up all at once." She dug into it with the pie server, and in a few minutes the whole pie had disappeared. Pippi patted her stomach contentedly. Mrs. Settergren had gone out into the kitchen, so she knew nothing about the accident to the cream pie. But the other ladies looked very sternly at Pippi. No doubt they would have liked a little pie too. Pippi noticed that they looked a little disappointed and decided to cheer them up. "Now you mustn't feel bad about such a little accident," she said comfortingly. "The main thing is we have our health, and at a coffee party you should have fun." She then picked up a sugar bowl and tipped all the lump sugar in it onto the floor. "Well, my goodness," she said, "look at what I've done. How could I make such a mistake? I thought this bowl was full of granulated sugar. Bad luck seems to follow me today." Thereupon she took a sugar spoon out of another bowl and began to sprinkle granulated sugar all over the floor. "I hope you notice," she said, "that this is the kind of sugar you sprinkle on things. So it's perfectly all right for me to sprinkle it on the floor. Because why should there be sugar to sprinkle if somebody doesn't go and sprinkle it? That's what I'd like to know. Have you ever noticed how much fun it is to walk on a floor that has sugar sprinkled all over it?" she asked the ladies. "Of course, it's even more fun when you're barefoot," she added as she pulled off her socks and shoes and stockings. "You ought to try it too, because there's nothing more fun, believe me." At that moment, Mrs. Settergren came in, and when she saw the sugar all over the floor, she took Pippi firmly by the hand and led her over to the sofa to Tommy and Annika. Then she went over to the ladies and invited them to have more coffee. That the cream pie had disappeared made her happy, because she thought the ladies had liked it so much that they had eaten it all. Pippi, Tommy, and Annika sat talking quietly on the sofa. The fire crackled on the hearth, the ladies drank their coffee, and all was quiet and peaceful again. And as so often happens at coffee parties, the ladies began to talk about their servant problems. Apparently, they had not been able to get very good servants, for they were not at all satisfied with them, and they agreed that it was really better not to have any servants at all. It was much more satisfactory to do things yourself, because then at least you knew that things were done right. Pippi sat on the sofa listening, and after the ladies had talked a while, she said, "Once my grandmother had a servant named Malin. She had chilblains on her feet, but otherwise there was nothing wrong with her. The only annoying thing was that soon as company came, she would rush at them and bite their legs. And bark. Oh, how she would bark. You could hear it all through the neighborhood, but only because she was playful. Only, of course, strangers didn't always understand this. The dean's wife, an elderly woman, came to see grandmother soon after Malin first came. And when Malin came dashing at her and bit her in the ankle, the dean's wife screamed so loudly that it scared Malin, so that her teeth clamped together and she could not get them apart. There she sat, stuck to the dean's wife's ankle until Friday. and Grandmother had to peel the potatoes herself. But at least it was well done. She peeled so well that when she was done, there were no potatoes left, only peelings. But after that Friday, the dean's wife never came to call on Grandmother again. She just never could take a joke. And poor Malin, who was always so good-natured and happy. Though, for that matter, she was a little touchy at times. There's no denying that. Once, when Grandmother poked a fork in her ear, she howled all day. Pippi looked around and smiled pleasantly. "Yep, that was Malin for you," she said, and twiddled her thumbs. The ladies acted as if they had heard nothing. They continued to talk. "If my Rosa would only clean," said Mrs. Bergren, "then maybe I could keep her, but she's a regular pig." "Say, you ought to have seen Malin," Pippi interrupted. "Malin was so outrageously dirty that it was a joy to see her," Grandmother said. For the longest time, Grandmother thought she had a very dark complexion. Honest and true, it was nothing but dirt that would wash off. And once at a bazaar in the city hotel, she got first prize for dirt under her nails. "Mercy me, how dirty that girl was," said Pippi happily. Mrs. Settergren looked at her sternly. "Can you imagine," said Mrs. Granberg, "the other evening when Britta was going out, she borrowed my blue satin dress without even asking. Isn't that dreadful?" "Yes, indeed," said Pippi. "She certainly must be cut from the same cloth as Malin, from what you say." Grandmother had a pink undershirt that she was specifically fond of. But the worst of it was that Malin liked it too. And every morning Grandmother and Malin argued about who was going to wear that undershirt. At last they decided it would be fair to take turns, and each wear it every other day. But imagine how tricky Malin could be. Sometimes she'd come running in when it wasn't her turn at all and say, "No mashed turnip today if I can't wear the pink woolen undershirt." Well, what was Grandmother to do? Mashed turnip was her very favorite dish. There was nothing to do but give Malin the shirt. As soon as Malin got the shirt, she went out into the kitchen as nice as could be and began to mash the turnip, so that it would be splattered all over the walls. There was silence for a little while, and Miss Alexanderson said, "I'm not absolutely certain, but I strongly suspect that my Hilda steals. In fact, I've noticed some things disappear." "Malin," began Pippi, but Mrs. Settergren interrupted her. "Children," she said decidedly, "go up to the nursery immediately." "Well, yes, but I was only going to tell that Malin stole too," said Pippi. "Like a raven. Everything she could lay her hands on. She used to get up in the middle of the night and steal. Otherwise she couldn't sleep well," she said. Once she stole Grandmother's piano and tucked it into her own top dresser drawer. She was very clever with her hands, Grandmother said. Tommy and Annika took hold of Pippi and pulled her out of the room and up the stairs. The ladies began on their third cups of coffee. Mrs. Settergren said, "It's not that I want to complain about my Ella, but she does break china." A red head appeared over the stairwell. "Speaking of Malin," she said, "maybe you're wondering if she used to break any china. Well, she did. She set apart one day a week just to break china. It was Tuesday," Grandmother said. "As early as 5 o'clock on Tuesday morning, you could hear this jewel of a maid in the kitchen breaking china. She began with the coffee cups and the glasses and the little things like that, and then went on to soup bowls and dinner plates, and she finished up with platters and soup turns. There was such a crash bang in the kitchen all morning that it was a joy to hear," Grandmother said. And if Malin had any spare time late in the afternoon, she would go into the drawing room with a little hammer and knock down the antique East Indian plates that were hanging on the walls. "Grandmother bought new china every Wednesday," said Pippi, and disappeared up the stairs as quickly as a jack-in-the-box. But now Miss Settergren's patience had come to an end. She ran up the stairs and into the nursery and up to Pippi, who had just begun to teach Tommy to stand on his head. "You must never come here again," said Mrs. Settergren, "if you can't behave any better than this." Pippi looked at her in astonishment, and her eyes slowly filled with tears. "That's just what I was afraid of," she said. that I couldn't behave properly. It's just no use to try. I'll never learn. I should have stayed on the ocean." She curtsied to Mrs. Settergren, said goodbye to Tommy and Annika, and went slowly down the stairs. The ladies were now getting ready to go home, too. Pippi sat down in the hall near the shelf where the shoes were kept and watched the ladies putting on their hats and coats. "Too bad you don't like your maids," she said. "You should have had one like Malin. Grandmother said there was nobody like her. Imagine." One Christmas, when Malin was going to serve a little roast pig, do you know what she did? She had read in the cookbook that roast pig must be served with frill paper in the ears and an apple in the mouth. But poor Malin didn't understand that it was the pig who was supposed to have the apple and the paper. You should have seen her when she came in on Christmas Eve with her best apron on and a big Gravenstein apple in her mouth. "Oh, Malin, you are crazy," Grandmother said to her. And Malin couldn't say a word in her own defense because she could only wiggle her ears until the frill paper rustled. To be sure, she tried to say something, but it just sounded like blub, 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 blub. And of course, she couldn't bite people in the leg as she usually did, and it would be a day when there was a lot of company. Poor little Malin. It just wasn't a very happy Christmas Eve for her, said Pippi sadly. The ladies were now dressed and at last said goodbye to Mrs. Settergren. And Pippi ran up to her and whispered, "Forgive me because I couldn't behave myself. Goodbye." Then she put on her large hat and followed the ladies. Outside the gate their ways parted. Pippi went toward Villa Villacula and the ladies went the other direction. When they had gone a little way, they heard someone panting behind them. It was Pippi, who had come racing back. You can imagine how that grandmother mourned when she lost Malin. Just think, one Tuesday morning when Malin had time to break only about a dozen teacups, she ran away and went to sea. And grandmother had to break all the china herself that day. She wasn't used to it, poor thing, and she got blisters all over her hands. She never saw Malin again. And that was a shame because she was such an excellent maid, grandmother said. Pippi left and the ladies hurried on. But when they had gone a couple of 100 feet, they heard Pippi from far off yelling at the top of her lungs, "She never swept under the beds either." And that is chapter 9. Chapter 10, Pippi acts as a lifesaver. Oh boy, we're almost to the end of our Pippi Longstocking book. I hope you have a great weekend. Come see us in the library.